When you finished an Intarsia knitting project, you're not really done knitting it until you have dealt with weaving in ends. Ends are one of the things that people really dislike about Intarsia because part of how you achieve these beautiful, bold, geometric designs on the right side of your work, part of how you do that is by having extra ends on the wrong side of your work. If you've knit Intarsia before, you'll know to knit something like a square like this involves knitting with one strand of, in this case, navy yarn back and forth, and then that first strand ends up filling in around this other pocket of color, which is its own short strand of yarn. But then once we've added that other color, there's another strand of navy happening over here. So hence we have our cast on and bind off tails here and here, plus the contrasting color tails here and here, plus the tail where we've joined the other end of our navy yarn that we're using and where we finished using that other end. So this is a fairly mild instance of Intarsia tails, but they can get a little bananas, just warning you. So the way we actually deal with these ends of our Intarsia tails are as follows. So we've cut our yarn and we've left about a 6-inch, 8-inch tail, somewhere in the neighborhood of that, for all of our ends. Now, since you're watching an Intarsia tutorial video, I'm going to just assume, I'm going to go ahead and assume you know what to do with your cast on and bind off tails and just leave those hanging out for the sake of time. But our Intarsia tails specifically, so these tails that touch this Intarsia motif of cream, we got to do some stuff with those because otherwise our knitting will fall apart and nobody wants that. Most tutorials say like, just duplicate stitch your tails into the same color of the tail. So in that case, it would be duplicate stitching the creams into that section of our swatch and knitting and duplicate stitching these navy tails into the navy part. But sometimes the problem with duplicate stitch is that it adds bulk and looks like crap because your where you've woven in that tail becomes twice as thick of a yarn as the whole rest of the body of your piece. So what I like to do in Intarsia, because there are these notorious tails that kind of suck to deal with, what I like to do is sew right into my seams. Easy freaking peasy. So to do this, you grab your tail, you thread it onto a tapestry needle, or you can use a crochet hook if you prefer that. And what you do is you pull on that tail just a little bit, not too tight, because if you pull it too tight, you'll have some puckering on the right side of your work, which you don't want. And what I'm going to do is make sure that I bring that tail over the top of the loop it's locked into. So what we're going to do is parallel what these interlocking stitches look like by bringing that over the top of that navy stitch in this case. All right. Then what we've got to do is find our seam here and sew right into the back of it, okay? And actually, I'm going to sew just into the back of the first stitch here, and make sure you're weaving in your tails on the wrong side. So what I'm going to do is make my interlock happen by sewing up into this stitch above, and remember to be working on the wrong side of your work. And then what I'm going to do is sew right into this ridge, just back and forth, right into that seam. All right, so we have a right side and wrong side to our work, and we've sewn into this seam of our interlocking Intarsia joins of colors right at that seam. So that's what I did for the cream color. And now I'm going to grab the tail of the blue color and go in that same seam in the opposite direction. It adds a tiny bit of bulk, but on the right side of your work, it's going to add less bulk than the duplicate stitch would. And if you really like duplicate stitch, go ahead and do it. It's your own knitting. Live your life. Do what you want. I'm in support of that. We make things so we can make them how we want to make them, whether that's technically correct or it's just done. So that little soapbox speech aside, I am just sewing back up through that seam just like we did with the cream. And voila. So that's one seam. So you can see it's a lot less pretty than just these plain interlocking stitches. So if you really want to do the duplicate stitch, you don't end up with this extra twist, that's fine. I can show you how to do that as well. Let's take a quick look at the right side of our work before we do that though. So you can see right here, this is the seam I just did the end weaving into and you can see that there's no longer a little gap in our work right there because we've woven in that end by interlocking it with those navy yarns. But right here on the side of the square that we haven't woven in yet, there's this big old gap. And part of weaving in ends is closing that gap. So let's make sure we do that, even if we're doing the duplicate stitch method. So to make sure that gap closes, because remember it's right there, what we're gonna do is thread our tapestry needle and make sure that we're working, that we pull the tail in this direction without pulling too much because we gotta worry about our tension. We pull this way and catch a strand of yarn just to make sure the tension around that gap comes toward itself and closes up, all right? So we've closed that up. And now, I guess, since so many people like it, just kidding, again, it's your knitting, you can do what you want. You can duplicate stitch, and duplicate stitch is just knitting with your tail in parallel to the surrounding stitches. Just making sure that you're working into the same color of yarn, and just follow a strand and sew right into it, like so. All right, I'm going to stop there for demonstration's sake. And finally, to weave in this last end using duplicate stitch, remember you've got to close that gap. So this gap is right here, and this tail is coming from a stitch to the left of this cream square. So we're going to need to pull it closed, like pull the tension of that stitch toward the right. So we do that by pulling the tail just a little, but not too much, and sewing up into a stitch. And then we know that's closed because it's lying in parallel with this line of interlocking stitches. And then we just find some stitches to duplicate stitch into. So I'm going to do that by going here and just sewing into the line of navy stitches just above our cream Intarsia square, like so. So there's a couple different ways to deal with weaving in ends in Intarsia. Obviously, I prefer the one that looks a lot messier at the join here on the back, because this one looks so much cleaner, but the duplicate stitch does double the bulk of every given stitch. So it's up to you for how you want the front of your work to look. For reference, this left side of this square is where I knit into the seam at the back, right there, and then right here where it's thicker, like I said it would be, that is where I did the duplicate stitch there, and then above the square here. A couple other things with weaving in ends and finishing Intarsia are that you can do some things with wet blocking your work, so soaking it in cold water, forming its shape like you would do if you were washing any like delicate wash knit sweater. You would soak that in cold water, lay it flat to dry, like reforming the, in this case, square shape you're going for. And then another thing, if you have an issue with your stitches looking a little wonky at the interlocking part, so where we did the interlocking to join our navy and cream stitches, if anything's looking a little wonky there, you can do a little bit of dry blocking with the tip of your knitting needle or a tapestry needle, like I'm about to do. And like this stitch right here, for example, is just a little bit like angling to the right, and you can just pull on it a teensy bit to even out that angle. But nothing really works as well as wet blocking, which I advocate doing literally all the time, in addition to swatching. So here's a swatch. You can see that it's just an easy square and a square. It's a great way, without even needing a pattern, to practice basic two-color Intarsia and weaving in your ends.